virtual guest today. She'll be presenting on understanding educators' self-efficacy, compassion fatigue, and school connectedness during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Yang is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research interests focus on understanding how school community members interact with their social context to find their resilience in the face of a variety of risk factors, including bullying, teacher-targeted violence, mental health, and public health challenges. She's been conducting research using multi-level and multi-informant approaches to understand the functions of malleable factors such as school climate, SEL, school-wide practice, and culture norms in school-based prevention and intervention, targeting well-being and engagement of students, teachers, and families from diverse cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Dr. Yang is a nationally certified school psychologist. She was the recipient of the 2019 Early Career Research Award from the Society of the Study of School Psychology, the 2019 Early Career Award from the Alberti Center for Bullying Abuse Prevention, and the 2020 National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. So Dr. Yang is going to present for about 1 hour, so about until 12:30 here today. And then we're going to have about 10 minutes after her presentation for some questions from the audience. We are going to leave the last 5 minutes available for you to complete an online evaluation for us today. So a link at that time will be posted in the chat. And for those of you that want NASP CPDs, you can fill out that evaluation, and the NASP documentation of attendance will be available at the end of that evaluation. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that that's coming your way at the end here. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Yang.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here to join the Alberti community. And I'm very excited to share my work related to educator resilience. I'm going to share my slides first. Can you all see? Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Stephanie. Before we started the presentation, just want to briefly mention a little bit about me. So I was trained as a science teacher in chemistry when I was in college, and I become very interested in school-based mental health and working with students and families. So I pursued a career in school psychology. And after working as a school psychologist for a few years, I back to the university started to working on the risk resilience culture research. So one of the reasons I'm very excited about sharing this project is because I feel like finally I'm working on something that really connected the different part of my passions all together, looking at the educator resiliency, looking at experiences of educators, but also looking at mental health. So the project I'm presenting today is the Educator Resilience Project. Part of this project was building on a research practice partnership between our research lab, the Risk Resilience Culture Lab at Berkeley, and also the local district in the California Bay Area. And the goal was to supporting district with adult and student social emotional learning. And as researchers, we also interested in understanding how we promote educational resilience and also understanding the risk of resilience factors contributing to the well-being. And I also like to use the opportunity to thank our collaborators, especially our SEO teams from the district and the directors of Research Practice Partnership and Community Engagement at Berkeley. I have 3 goals for the presentation today, and I will first using this Educator Resilience Project to give you an overview about some of the theoretical and empirical literatures related to educator self-efficacy and compassion fatigue. And then I will share some of the empirical findings related to educators' beliefs and practices related to school connectedness during the COVID-19 pandemic and digital learning phase, and especially focus on understanding how the different connection practice and beliefs, how they have a different influences to educators' well-being. So at the end, I will spend about 10 minutes to talk about some of the practical implications and recommendations that we can draw from those findings. So I already received some of the questions that you share with the Alberti Center, so I'm trying to incorporate into the last section. So in this work, the Educate Resilience Project, we use two main theoretical models to guide our work. One is the job demands resource model. We also call it JDR model, which is occupational stress models that suggest individuals' strain is a response to the imbalance between the demands from the position and also the resources they have to deal with those demands. Both the job demands and the resources influence the individual's well-being and performance through the motivational process and the health impairment process. So the motivational process here is refers to some of the refers to the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations that serves to enhance individuals' engagement in the position, as well as to help them motivations to the jobs. And for the health impairment process, so when the individuals, that means that when the jobs with high demands require more efforts and could drain individuals' energy, which could result in exhaustion and also decreased health status. So some examples of the resources, including like personal resources such as autonomy and the social support they receive from the colleagues and from the families or from the community. And for the job demands, it could be some of the risk factors they're facing, looking at classroom management, looking at the workload. So one of the part of this Educator Resilience Project we've been working on is looking at some risk factors related to teacher targeted violence. But when the COVID hit and closed the schools, a lot of our collaborating school members are experiencing tremendous emotional stress, anxieties, and they're also trying to figure out how can they address those challenges, especially those confronted by our most marginalized and vulnerable students and families. So when we had a lot of discussions with our school members, what really means and during this COVID context in terms of resources and demands, and what is underlying motivations and health impairment process that really link to this educator's well-being. It's a core question we're trying to answer in this project. And after a lot of discussion, we eventually focused on two core concepts, which is online teaching efficacy related to educator, and also their compassion fatigue. For online education, as all of you probably know about educator efficacy is educator perceptions of the capability to facilitate student learning of knowledge, values, and behaviors successfully. So when we're looking back to the self-efficacy literature, within this, without this online context, research has been identified 4 main sources of sources that could promote self-efficacy. One of the most influential sources is the previous mastery experience, which refers to experiences that you gained when you take on a new challenge and then successfully completing it. And this type of experience provides most authentic evidence about your ability to complete the confronting task. And the other important source of efficacy is their how you the role model, which means that when you're observing others who probably have similar background as you and successfully completing a task can really boost your beliefs about your ability. And the third one is this or the encouragement of the verbal persuasion, which refers to the encouragement that you received about individuals' performance or ability to perform the certain task. And also this physiological cues, such as which related to the emotional, physical, and psychological well-being is also another important source to influence self-efficacy belief. So those are the knowledge that we know during this pre-COVID or online context. But when we're looking at literatures, looking at educators' self-efficacy in this online context and also during the pandemic context, there are much less literatures take a look at this area. And there are a few, when we're looking at online learning, self-efficacy, a lot of research has been focused on post-secondary online learning. And based on those research, there are four main areas that has been identified closely linked to self-efficacy belief. One is the online instructional strategies and also students' engagement in the online platform, as well as the teachers' ability or educators' skills to manage the classroom. And the last one, but not the least one, is the technology use. Basically, when we're thinking about online learning, is a pedagogy that embedded in technology. So educators' capacity or confidence in using technology to facilitate learning is one of the most important beliefs that related to self-efficacy. So those are what we learn about literature related to self-efficacy. As for the compassion fatigue, the definition about the compassion fatigue varied. One of the definition that we are familiar with is talking about the secondary trauma stress, which resulting from wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person, or it defined as the cost of caring for others in emotional pain. So when we got compassion fatigue because we care or we used to care, and it's a very accumulated process. So you don't really suddenly develop compassion fatigue, and it has very profound shift in worldview and it can cause damaged fundamental beliefs or personality change. And researchers also mentioned that when we're thinking about compassion fatigue, the other very related construct or another source of stress is coming from just the job demand itself, which related to the burnout. And when we're thinking about those negative consequences related to burnout could be the reduced mental health and physical health, the difficulties performing job functioning, and also the undesired student outcomes. So a lot of some of the current measures looking at compassion fatigue are focusing on both secondary traumatic stress and also the burnout, conceptualizing those two as the key two sub-construct that we are measuring compassion fatigue. But there also have some fundamental differences. When you're thinking about burnout, when you leave the job, a large portion of those stress will go away. But thinking about secondary trauma, it actually could exist forever, and it has this fundamental shift or damage to the well-being. So that is some of the fundamental differences between those two constructs. And this is the models that we're using to conceptualize compassion fatigue in our research study. When COVID, one of the bigger questions that we have is, what does compassion fatigue means during this specific and unique context, and what are some of the beliefs educators have? So and related both the compassion fatigue and also self-efficacy. So we started to work on this, take on this task by sending by design, a collaborative design, a survey, and administered around about 300 educators from a large district in North California. As you can see, this is the demographics of the district as well as the participants who are included in our study. So one thing I want to mention is that there are some, so the demographic in thinking about racial ethnic composition and also the positions, there are some mismatch. I don't think it's totally aligned in terms of the gender differences and gender composition and racial ethnic compositions. So that has some implications when we're thinking about the research finding from this project, relative representation. And this is like a visual of how the participants' gender, racial, ethnic background, as well as the position. And we also ask about how many years they have been working in the field of education. So you can see that the majority of them, large portion has been in this 6 to 10 years working experiences in the field of education. So this is the survey questions that we asked educators about the online teaching self-efficacy. And we did some descriptive statistics. As you can see that about 46% of educators reported that somewhat agree towards those 4 different type of measures of teaching self-efficacy, looking at, I feel, as successfully adapt to my work to distance learning platform and help them learn new things and accomplish a lot, as well as the effectiveness of the work. But what is most informative is those open-ended questions that we ask educators at the end of each sections of the survey. So when we're looking, because it does tells us a lot about what is some of the underlying factors that contribute to their decreased self-efficacy. So some educators feel that they after shifting to the online learning, the whole learning context have been totally changed. So they feel they have landed on a whole new planet. And some educators also reported that some of in terms of the frustrations and also the helpless in terms of how the difficulties of holding students and families accountable, because realize that when students don't want to be reached, and they cannot reach them. So there's a lot of barriers in terms of technology and other family factors that could block the accountability between the teachers and students. And some educators also talking about the lack of feedbacks. All of those are the quotes from the teachers, and they're talking about when there are so little useful feedback. So sometimes they feeling she's feeling that she's shouting addition strategies in the ground. So there is like this lack of feedbacks that make drastically decrease self-efficacy, and also the efforts they put into improve the engagement is kind of like turning to be there's no feedback and putting a lot of efforts kind of like into a vacuum. So there are more quotes. All of those sense of efficacy has been linked to increases teacher stress. And some teachers feel very empty because they know what is possible, but they also know that they're not giving students what they know they could. So this sense of helpless or frustration also experienced by the teachers. And the teachers also mentioned about that this teacher, this re-energized mode of being in the in-person context has gone. And one teacher mentioned that now I no longer go home and problem solve and figure out the puzzles of the day. And I close my laptop and feel like an absolute failure. So the sense of frustration, a sense of unsuccessful really impacts student educators' well-being. So those are some of the quotes. Even though the majority of them are looking at this, reported they have lower self-efficacy, but we did find some positive reports that coming from teachers. One teacher was mentioned about at the beginning it was out control, but also in the middle they find some reasons, and so there is a growing process that getting better. And some other teachers also mentioned about that they're experiencing a learning curve, a digital learning curve, and they also feel a sense of empowerment when they feel that they are able to learn the ways that they never imagined. So this the sense of self-efficacy that was reported by some of the teachers when they overcome some of the technology or learning curves that has experienced. And some teachers actually feel more productive when they are working distantly because they found after they find the strategies to collaborate effectively with families, they find it's helpful to hold them accountable and also be able to make the work more productive. So those are some of the quotes that related to the teacher self-efficacy. Now we're looking at the compassion fatigue. Compared to self-efficacy, we can looking at more than half of the teachers has experiencing compassion fatigue. Some of the items are looking at their general stress and nerves. And also some of them are looking at the separation, the balance between the personal life and the work life. And we also ask questions about teachers' experiences of the secondary trauma related issues. So every time when we're thinking about the survey items, it's become less, when we compare to the quotes that are coming from teachers, just much less informative from my perspective. So I'm going to share a lot of quotes with you all, and hopefully that can give you some of them resonate with your experiences also. So some of course related to the stress and burnout. A teacher was mentioned that this is instead of being doing distant learning, this is really a crisis learning. So there's a lot of stress that coming from to cope with the crisis, and also the sense of out of control is really overwhelming. And some educators mentioned about that the works now is really much more about addressing the basic needs of educators. And there's much, they also started concern about students' academic progress. I also have to mention that this study was done in late spring, which is also during that semester. So a lot of report from teachers is based on the experiences in the spring semester, which is during this transition from the in-person learning to the distant learning. So during that early stage, there's a lot of work that educators involved in is really addressing the basic needs and also navigate and setting up the more of the academic learning platform. So you can see that this the stress coming from working on addressing those basic needs is very overwhelming. And some teachers also started questioning like what is really the point all of this, like starting questioning about what is really important about academics and school, that what's the purpose of schooling. So there's a lot of question and self-doubt around educators. And similar that when thinking about the burnout, a lot of teachers found that it's really hard to set the boundaries between the personal life and also the school life. So there's the sense of always felt on. Some teachers feels that compared to in-person learning, you have this immediate stress about trying to address the classroom disruptions or directly dealing with student traumas. There's this continuous dance of stress of uncertainty, which a lot of stress leads to the burnout. We did find some relatively positive response from the teachers, which is talking about teachers had to reflect on that there's some goodness or silver lining from this is that they are no longer stressed about asking teachers to compliance with the rules of the and also this in this overpopulated classrooms, the control, but then students actually could find a way to thrive at the level that they can control and also compliance. So there's a relatively more healthy ways of engaged in learning. In addition to those stress and burnout input that we received from educators, they also talk about this. We also ask some question about the stressors. What are some of the key stressors that link to those sense of emotional exhaustion? And when we rank them up, one of those top stressors is teachers' concerns about what school will look like after the shelter-in-place order is lifted. So that ranked as the most, the highest stressors. So as I mentioned before, for the compassion fatigue, in addition to the stress and burnout, the other important construct is related to secondary trauma. And based on teachers' report, a lot of them also express concerns about the traumas that their students experienced, because when thinking about the context of the school district is a large urban school district, and there's large portion of students and families are coming from this under-resourced and unserved populations. So teachers are worried about the safety of the students, and also worry about their unsafe unsafe home environment. And those concerns, worries that exacerbate the existing anxieties and coping strategies. Some of the themes that coming from the compassion fatigue related is also the teachers, educators, griefs about inequity that they observed during this crisis. And there's one quote that was like, is very insightful from of the teachers talking about this racial dynamics, thinking about educators' background, because there is some when we think about alignment about a teacher's background, racial ethnic background, and student populations, teachers, educators started to reflect on some of the structural racism. And it is also happening during the time that protest is coming and out of the anti-racist movement. And this whole political climate is also resonate to with some of the compassion fatigue that educators has been reflect on. So in addition to, we were curious when we received some of those quotes and reflection compared to the compassion fatigue. We're also interested in understanding what are some of the racial ethnic differences in terms of how the compassion fatigue and online teaching self-efficacy varied across educators from different background, educators from different years of teaching, from different racial ethnic background, and also from different grade levels. And we didn't find much that large differences as than we expect, but we did find, it's actually this highlighted part is moved up. We did find there is significant differences between Black and white educators in terms of the well-being. So for Black educators reported higher sense of online teaching self-efficacy and lower sense of compassion fatigue. And this finding is pretty intriguing, because when we're thinking about from this minority stress theory perspective, the more stigmatized social groups actually experiencing more stress in addition to the general stress that coming to the specific group. So some of the possible reason contributed to this could be related to the mismatch in terms of the diversity of racial ethnic composition of the student population in the district and the school district and the educator population. So in this district, over 20% are Latino students, over 20% Black students, and over 10% about Asian students. So there's only about 10% white students. So when thinking about mismatch, and the mismatch between the educators and the students in the classroom and school can influence the compassion fatigue and the overall well-being. Another consideration has to be thought is that this educated compassion fatigue and self-efficacy scale was based on the self-reported survey using a Likert scale. So as we know, the psychological scale to a large extent is based on who they are comparing with. So in the sheltering in place and social distancing context, the lack of in-person interactions with other colleagues or educators could make educators rely less on the observation of the colleagues' compassion fatigue to choose the ratings when the survey was administered. So research has been showing that teachers, educators of colors, when in the in-person context, they are more likely to work in a more hostile environment. So as some educators reported that once they move into the hybrid context, this immediate stress actually suddenly dropped, like the immediate stress addressed the trauma or classroom management issues. So it's likely that they are rating on the self-efficacy and compassion fatigue based on experiences or comparison with the past experiences. So that could contribute to some of the differences of between the different racial ethnic background. And this is more of the visual in terms of different racial groups, online teaching efficacy and compassion fatigue. And we did also did some more in-depth analysis looking at how teacher efficacy is related to compassion fatigue. And we find that improving teacher self-efficacy could reduce educators' compassion fatigue. We also find that teachers with educator with high level of social emotional learning are more attuned to the negative consequences. So the educator with reported higher sense of SEL competencies, they probably more sensitive to the preventative effects of online teaching efficacy to compassion fatigue. So this protective roles of self-efficacy to compassion fatigue become more salient among the teachers who are reported have higher sense of SEL competency. And this study has been reporting in one of the manuscript that we're working on, and happy to share more research findings after the presentation. So that is one of the first question related to educator beliefs and about self-efficacy and compassion fatigue. In addition to understanding the beliefs about their well-beings, we're also interested in understanding what kind of factors are contributed to the decreased or increased well-being or compassion fatigue. And one of the key construct we focused on is looking at connectedness. And when we're looking at literatures, there's been a lot of literature prior to the COVID context has been focused on subjective perceptions of school connectedness, which when we're looking at literature, which is defined as the feelings of closeness to others in school and the sense of happiness and safe in school, a sense of belongingness. In this non-COVID context literature, it found that school connectedness is related to different type of subjective sense of connectedness with teacher leaders, with staff members or students are related to both increased teacher self-efficacy and the reduced emotional exhaustion, which linked to the compassion fatigue. So there is a very well evidenced link, but we really don't know much about educators' beliefs in this of connectedness in this COVID context. So we also ask some of those questions among educators looking at the sense of connectedness, perceptions, subjective perceptions, how they were treated by others in the school, especially about the roles of the functions of school, or the concept of school has drastically changed during the school closure. And what we found is that the majority of teachers, over 90%, report favorably about their sense of school connectedness. And when we're looking at some of the quotes, some teachers feel that we actually find more positive comments or input from teachers. Some of them feel that they feel more connected to with their staff, especially the grade level teams, because they work together through this process, and then they also some teachers feel they work better with small group, and then being in this online context, they actually help them to create this kind of space to working with the small group settings. Some educators also feel more connected because they feel they don't no longer waste of time on issues that aren't related to learning. Some educators feeling more focused on feeling that the schools, after the school closure and pandemic, schools are prioritized this in terms of building relationship, building connections among communities has been prioritized, and then that has been valued, and then that could increase some of the sense of school connectedness. But there's also a lot of teachers express concern about school connectedness. One one of the quotes I was talking about is this: one of the theme that merged is this concerns about when we think about the functions of connectedness for teachers. One of the important roles is providing this soundboard or the outlet for formation and joy, and those outlet is no longer available anymore. And I really like the quote and thinking about the teacher was talking about the feeling isolated, and then also no physical contact with anyone. And for someone who thrives in this interpersonal relationship, is really challenging. And some of the concerns about the connectedness is related to the anxiety and the conflict feelings between the feeling of worried about being around with students' families because of the COVID risk, but also the emotional joys that they used to have when they are interacting with students and families. Is it actually this conflict feeling that they're enjoying the being with students, but they cannot or fear be with students during COVID is trigger a lot of anxiety and stress. And some educators also reported that in this in-person conversation is much easier, but during the distance learnings, the tones or even tones from the email text could be disturbing. So there could be some miscommunications during the online learning or distance communication. And there is also a mental blocks during online meetings for some educators. Some other educators also mentioned that they no longer have this community of have someone knowing someone are going through the same struggles, validate their struggles on a daily basis, so that this source of affirmation or the source of validation has go away. There's one quote that I think kind of very insightfully talk about the sense of the function or the basic function or basic purpose of being connected with others. This educator once mentioned about at schools, we always joke that when one of us is having a rough day with the kids, we all come out of the classroom and see 3 other fresh teachers and realize we all have the same kind of day. And that could help release a lot of stress and coming from a demand teaching. But those opportunities of confirmation or validation has gone away, and they have no idea about if they are the only one that feel the same way, or if everybody else have the similar experiences. So this disconnection really block this the source of information. and validation. So that's some of the beliefs. And the third question that in our research, this research study, we're also wondering about, so we talk about school connectedness, but we're also wondering about who they are connect with, and did this connecting with whom really matter, and how does that make, if that matters, how does that make a differences about who they are connecting with, and how those different beliefs and practices or actions related to the educator well-being, how do they influence the educator's well-being differently or similarly. So we ask, one of the questions that we ask is, how often do they attempt to connect with different type of school members, teachers, staff, administrators, students, and also family members. As you can see that the highest frequency of making connection is those blue one, that students and teachers try and make attempts to connect with students more than 5 times a week. And also there is also a relative lower frequency, but also a large percentage of educators are connected with administrators. So those are this pattern of majority of them are making a lot of attempts to with different family, different school community members. And how does this different type of actions of making connection will make impact on their teaching self-efficacy and compassion fatigue? So we did some of the statistical analysis trying to see how different types of attempts to making connection, as well as their subjective school connectedness, influence their teaching self-efficacy and compassion fatigue. As you can see that we found that school connectedness functions as protective factors or promotive factors to teacher self-efficacy. So teachers feeling higher sense of school connectedness, they reported higher sense of self-efficacy and lower level of compassion fatigue. So aligned with literature's back prior to the COVID context, the sense of the subjective perceptions of school connectedness is a strong protective factors for teachers' well-being. And I was trying to find some quote, because this is a lot of teachers talk about this, but this quote was talking exactly reflect on this connection. They talk about, I feel extremely connected with other teachers and principals, maybe even more, but by connecting with them had made this process much less stressful for me. So definitely this sense of a connectedness before or even after the COVID that impacted their input and promote their the well-being. However, when we're looking at the different types of connections or the frequency of making attempts to administrators and students, it varied. So what we didn't find all different type of attempts connections have a significant impact on the well-being. It's actually the connection or the attempts to connect with administrators. It does improve the teaching self-efficacy. This could relate it to in thinking about some of the technical support or instructional support that teacher receive from with administrators. And it's interesting to find that the attempts to connect with students is actually increase their educators' compassion fatigue. So this that functions as risk factors to educator compassion fatigue. And there are several reasons. And so from our quote is actually help us to understand why making this physical attempt to or action-based connections could increase the educator compassion fatigue. Some educators reported that they feeling they are needing to be available 24/7, and they have this feeling of being held responsible for students refuse to engagement. So that it increased the stress level and also increased the burnout. And it's also very stressful that a lot of times when they are being constantly contacted, even over the weekend, they feel stressful that they have been stopped doing what they are doing and have to take care of that crisis. So there is this more of the attempts or some of the more frequent connection or communications actually increase the job demands of teachers. But some educators also concerned about they lost complete contact with students. So that could also increase the stress because they are being held responsible for for students' refusal to engagement. So that could be related too, especially when they are attempts to connect with students, but there is no way that they can hold off the students. And some educators would reported about this balance, this communication in a way that can engage in students and also recognize own boundaries. When we're thinking about this in the in-person learning, this boundary could be set at home, but now all of this, the boundary has been broken because everything is happening at home. And some educators just cannot use to was not feel interested in technology and don't feel that technology is a way that to make connection with others. So that could increase in terms of the unfamiliarity with technology or the loss of interest that can block the capability of connecting with communicating with students. So these are, in addition to looking at how different type of school connectedness and attempts to making connections with educators, we're also interested in looking at how those factors interact with each other, how the educator resource and demands interact with each other. So we did some further analysis and to looking at if we know that school connectedness is important preventative factor for compassion fatigue. For those teachers, this promotive and preventative roles of school connectedness could be, we found that it could be enhanced when they are making more attempts to connect with students, which means that when educators have this more proactive or positive feelings about schools, making attempts to connect with students could help to boost that preventative role. In terms of the school connectedness related to self-efficacy, this promoted roles of connectedness to self-efficacy are also enhanced by making attempts to the families when we're thinking about teaching important roles of parents in this home schooling and online teaching. So by connecting with families, troubleshooting with families, that could increase educators' self-efficacy in online teaching. So these are the three research questions that we're trying to answer in this research study. In terms of, I know that we know that every study has some limitations, so we have to recognize that some of the findings have to be interpreted under the context of some of the limitation of study. So in this research study, it's a one-time survey, anonymous surveys. So there is, based on this educator's self-report, another limitation is that the samples compared to the overall school samples is relatively smaller. So the representatives or generalizations of those findings to the larger educated population can be limited. And another limitation is that it could be a strength or limitation is that the study focused on this very unique period of times that when educators are transitioned from the distant online in-person schooling to online learning. So there's a very unique concepts and unique stressors that unique needs that to be addressed during that expected time. So the context of and the dynamics could be very different from this new school years when we have more online learning technology platforms set up on when preparation has been done. So it will be interesting to looking at how the educator perceptions of the online teaching self-efficacy, their compassion fatigue and connectedness involved when school have longer times in this online distant learning period. So currently we are looking at some of the longitudinal change by working with district to collect longitudinal data across 3 different time points throughout the school year. We're also very interested to understanding about the efficacy at the collective level, because what we found that once during this crisis mode, this group dynamics could influence a lot about teachers' well-being. So how educators and leaders working with staff to building this collective sense of efficacy and also the sense of compassion, um, reflect on the sense of compassion, satisfaction, and thinking about the positive things as educators, how those feelings of beliefs that influence their well-being. And we're also looking at some of the intervention, exploring the intervention studies by collaborating with the district SEL teams on looking at effectiveness of some of the professional development to address their needs. Okay, so that is the research findings from the study. And for the third goal of the presentations, focus on the practical implication and recommendations. As I mentioned before that, I'm trying to including some of your question you have when you register the webinar, and trying to integrate into the resources or recommendations I'm sharing today. And I think those questions are falling to like 3 large category. One is thinking about the self-care, compassion, and resilience, and the others thinking about what are some recommendations talking about to building connectedness and communities with school members, and also thinking about learning and engagement. I use this visual because I think these 3 levels of practice or practical recommendations go hand in hand. And also there is priority difference of when we're thinking about to ultimately achieve engaged learning or effective teaching, we have to first address our own needs, educators' needs, or administrators' needs. The basic needs has to be covered, and also building those a lot of times, but after building those connections, building the connection communities, will set up the foundations of engaged living. So effective pedagogy cannot happen without a connective community. So I think it's important to recognize that this strategy is also related, but also there is a high priority related to 3 of them. So related to compassion or even compassion fatigue, I think one of the practical implication or recommendation is the thinking about we have to, for educators, it's important to recognize the signs of compassion fatigue. Using different tools, self-report assessment could be a very informative tools, but might not be the only way to assess the risk when thinking about as a whole group or in personally. Daily check-in are as a routine to really check into our self, like tensions about tensions in our body and worries, and thinking and recognizing the signs of when, and also seeking for help when needed. And another recommendation is to really thinking about making self-care part of this routine. And a few days ago, I attended a very informative webinar by Dr. Brandy Ashley, was talking about this setting up this personalized plan for educator resilience. And there was a lot of useful tools. And I think she mentioned about it will be helpful. Feel free to reach out to her for some of the helpful tools that you can help to build up the healthy mind habits. And also thinking about, I think one of the themes coming up in the input from the educators is the sense of out control. So how do we manage the stress when we feel the situation is out of control? So what are some decision making point they have to make to cognitively manage that stress? So using some of the tools cognitive tools is very helpful. And talking about self-care, I think there is also the trend of this micro doses, thinking about when we are doing this self-care practices, you don't have to do this long duration as actually more effective when you are doing this more higher frequent but lower shorter duration type of practice is helpful. And it's also easier to build into your daily routines. And talking about the compassion, like I mentioned before, when discuss those with some of the educators and leaders in the district, we also talk about the sense of compassion that we have to practice as a group, as this collective compassion. So in social psychology, there is this hypothesis about the shared plight when individuals are disclosed the challenges or what they suffering as a group is actually a very powerful process could remove a lot of distress and also a lot of self-doubt because during this very isolated period of times, a lot of times we feeling stressed and not sure if this is just happening to ourselves, is it attributed by ourselves or it's really the context. So building up the space allow an individual to engage in the collective compassion practice can really helpful to reduce some of the stress. Talking about the building, another implication for the connectedness, building healthy connectedness and community, there's a lot of resources that has been available. I would recommend to look into some of the strategies, the lesson plan that's being shared by one of the research group from Harvard. They have this in-person relationship maps that help students, school members to identify the individual with this needs for making connection with others. And recently there is also this virtual tools or online lesson that you can use during the virtual classroom to mapping out students' relationship, how to making connections between adults and students, and also among staff. So this is very handy lesson plan and strategies. And I think the Bright Ways Global Academy also have this very informative tips and also recommendations to building this web of support connections. And they also have this color-coded strategies that can use for younger kids that related to what are some practical practices that could making connections. One of the implications from the input or the findings from study is looking focus on thinking about the check-in or making connections, is really talking more about the quality rather than quantity. So the frequency, as you can see that sometimes those frequent connections with students could decrease the stress or demand. So how do we balance that we making connection with with students or families, but not brought up the overwhelming fatigue or demands. So that is by improving the quality of the checking could be a way to go. I know some of you have questions about as helping professions or educators or school counselors, we're struggling with keeping this boundaries and interactions because now there's with online learning and homeschooling, it's even harder to keep that boundary. And IES, the Institution of Educational Science, they provide some very helpful guidelines or strategies when thinking about how do we improve this healthy boundary connections, such as provide connection channels to meet different needs, so that when you allocate different channels to address different needs, that could help to remove some of the overlapping boundary or this to allocate to make sure that to redirect the different connection needs to different staff or helping professions with different expertise. And it's also in the communication or making connections in classroom, it's important to share the communication norms and also be open to revise and create policies as needed, because we are living in a very changing context, and it's important to respond to the changing needs in terms of policy and procedures. and also make sure that there's a two-way connection or communication opportunities so that create this feedback loops. As you remember that a lot of teachers talking about this lack of feedbacks when they are isolated. So how can we create those two-way communication is very important. And sometimes we need to proactively setting up the work hours or scheduled breaks too, so that we can engage in more self-care practices in more frequent ways or maybe shortened period. And in addition to talk about the challenges we're facing, it's also helpful for district and school medias to channels to share those positive stories about the community. When we're thinking about back to this job demands resource models, that one way is to decrease those demands, but the other way is to really try to increase the resources. So this positive vibes and positive feelings or energy can really help to boost that motivational process. And then in terms of the improving engagement and teaching efficacy, I think one of the as I mentioned, that this basic needs has to be met before we engage, before we thinking about pedagogy or instruction. And the CDC provide this very helpful checklist for families and educators thinking about what are some of the basic needs items that we have to address before we set up the effective online teaching. Another important concept that is very related to classroom engagement and learning is talking about the flow. As some of you know, that this concept flow is describing this highly engaged state during the learning when the students or learners skills and the challenges they are facing matched a congruence. And also their skills and challenges also have to surpass a certain level. So this is like the definition of this flow, but makes me also thinking about how can we promote the flows in this online learning environment. So when you're thinking about this visual, when we are trying to navigate the new learning and teaching platform, one of the is this process, how can we adjust the challenges or the instructional content to meet the skills, to match the skills that students have. When they are consistent, students are more likely to be engaged in the learning process. And some studies also started looking at how flow works in the online learning platform. And in addition to the match between the skills and challenge, there are also some important factors we have to consider that unique to this online virtual environment is the sense of control of the virtual environment. When you're facing technology issues, that loss of control of the technology, that doesn't really promote the flow. But also thinking about how can we create this virtual environment that create this to make students feel they are physically present in this learning context, and how do we, and the focused attention, what kind of strategies that we can use to promote and to redirect them attention to our Zoom meetings or online discussion. So these are some additional considerations when we are thinking about how do we design our instruction to promote the flow in the e-learning context. And there are also a lot of collections of resources available there. And then here's some links to some, there are some AEI, American Institute of Research has done a national study looking at there's some promising district practices across many states, and there's a very comprehensive report that describes some of the practices. And I think one of the helpful information we can get is thinking about from the global scale, because we know that different countries moving to this crisis mode at different point. So it's helpful to see how educators in different country or in different time frame, that how they cope with some of the strategy, what are effective when they are in that crisis mode. So that's here's some links about some of the resources that have been collected internationally. At the last two slides, I just want to add a little bit more, a few more recommendation implications that for administrators, and those are some of the collective wisdom that we collected from the teacher leaders from a collaborating district, and they were talking. The leaders was sharing that some of the effective, one of the important considerations thinking about when leaders or educate or administrators are coping with crisis, they are also have to recognize they also experience a lot of stress. The leader attrition is also a very important issues right now. So I'm thinking about how what kind of self-care practices could help to promote educators' well-being, and educators also need to allocate the space and time for them to engage in those self-care practice. One of the some of the recommendations or the concerns that educators raised during in their survey in some of open-ended question is sometimes they are feel frustrated that there's when there's a lack of clear, timely practices in terms of the school communication. So the making the improve the clarity and timeless is important as administrator when we communicate with the school staff. And like I said before, I think administrators at this ideal position to promote this collective, collective self-efficacy and building team capacity, and also engage in this collective compassion practice. Thinking about some of the from the system level is also important. So these are that's all my presentation. Yeah, and so now thank you everybody for listening, and I'm happy to taking any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yang, for your presentation. I found it to be just really moving and just really engaging. I really loved the quotes that you had that you did in addition to some of that quantitative research. I just found them to be really moving. So I really appreciate that. Just a couple things. We only have a couple minutes left here. So I just wanted to let everyone know that the slides from Dr. Yang's presentation are posted on the Alberti Center website, and that link has been put in the chat, and the recording will also be available to you. So that will be sent out via email. It'll also be posted on social media and on the website. So just, I know there was a couple questions about that, so I wanted to let everyone know that. And then the other thing is that the evaluation has also been put in the chat. So we would like for everyone to just to take a couple minutes to complete the evaluation. And for those that want the NASP CPDs, you'll need to complete the evaluation in order to download your documentation of attendance for that. So I think because we only have a couple minutes left, and Dr. Yang did such a really nice job answering a lot of the questions that came in as part of the registration into the Alberti Center, I think we might just allow this time for participants to just complete the evaluation, if that's okay with you, Dr. Yang. Just so we have these 5 minutes left here. I do want to note the next Alberti Center virtual colloquium. I just wanted to put in a note for that so people can put it in their calendar. So our next virtual colloquium is going to be on February 18th at the same time, so 11:30 to 12:45 Eastern Standard Time. We're going to have Dr. Sherry Bowman and Gina Yoon will be with us virtually presenting on the role of teachers in reducing bullying in schools. So this information on our next colloquium will be up on our website really soon, and you'll also be able to register through our website. So hopefully we'll see all or most of you virtually in February. And thank you so much, Dr. Yang, for your presentation today. We really appreciate the information. So thank you again for coming, and thank you to all of the attendees for coming. And once you complete the evaluation, you're welcome to log off. So thank you so much, everyone.